Welcome to the Starbase Stories. Subscribe to the Den. If you love HFY where humans break rules, then rewrite them. The herald's voice shimmered over the crowd as torches guttered against a rising amber-hued wind. The Ember Veil had arrived early over Olyssar, the city of ribs and bridges, a seasonal curtain of charged dust that made hair lift and lanterns sing in glass-throated harmony. Jace Marin, human envoy on loan and professional tailor by compulsion, knelt on a dais of blackwood to pin the final line of sigil lace along a queen's ceremonial mantle, each stitch an oath recorded by reactive gold. He was not supposed to speak. He was definitely not supposed to improvise, but the fabric hummed and the queen flinched and a spark jumped. Jace's gloved hand, steady a breath before, slipped and brushed the inside of her wrist beneath the veil. A gasp rippled across the atrium. Not for the touch, humans were clumsy. For the color, the sigil lace flashed carmine, unfurling a ring of script like a rose of law. Jace froze. The queen didn't. Her eyes, vulpine bright beneath the ember veil, narrowed in something between wonder and amusement. "By the veil's vote," she said softly, "the wrist mark has answered." A councillor hissed. A bell tolled, its tone bending as the dust thickened outside like a living chorus. Jace swallowed, then did what all disaster-tested humans do. He smiled. "Your Majesty, with respect, I was aligning the hem." "The hem aligned you," said the councillor, grey braids trembling. "Wrist to wrist beneath the veil is proposal. Under oathcloth it is binding intent. Under pledge gold it is—" She stopped, blanching at the last clause. "The Ember Pact," the queen finished, voice low enough to slip under skin. Murmurs shivered. Jace's brain offered several exit strategies, all equally illegal. "Context," he whispered, because humor was the last torch in a blackout. Her lips tilted. "Context, our ancestors forged a law that the veil itself witnesses unions it favors. Touch at the pulse, under oathcloth, during the first song of the storm, and the city binds us, unless publicly denied before the third bell." "Good," said Jace. "Bells are loud. Love clarity." Torchlight flickered. The first bell faded. The councillor stepped forward with a staff that housed a nest of thin chains. "Majesty, the archive will riot," she murmured. "He is off-world. Worse, he is a contractor." Jace lifted his hands, palms open. "I can deny publicly," he offered, even as the sigil lace warmed his wrist like a cat deciding ownership. The queen measured him, gaze skimming scars stitched into his knuckles, lingering on the careful way he stood between her and the rail. Small, accidental acts that read as habit, not performance. "Or," she said, "we could ask the veil for a second opinion." "Indeed, politely," Jace said. "Traditionally," she corrected, "it prefers spectacle." Outside, the ember veil thickened until the city's bone bridges looked like ribs lit from within. Music rose as the glass throats sang, orchestras made of windows and lanterns. Crowds gathered along the promenade below, faces turned up, expecting the Queen's oath walk, a ritual stroll across the open skyway to sanctify her mantle before coronation rites. "Majesty," the councillor pressed, "if he steps onto the oath walk at your side, the veil will read it as affirmation." Jace caught the queen's eye. "Clarity," he said again, then, careful, palms visible, offered his wrist. Her fingers hovered, then settled over his pulse with a pressure that said confidence, not need. "Walk with me," she said. The atrium doors groaned open. Wind rushed in, flaring the mantle into a living flame. The second bell began to toll. They stepped onto the oathwalk as the city roared, and the sigil lace flooded red enough to stain the air. "Smile," Jace murmured. "We're being televised by physics." "Then give them a reason to cheer," she murmured back, and squeezed his wrist once, a signal older than law. A figure vaulted onto the far end of the skyway, an armored warden in H6 lattice, visor spitting blue warnings. "By council edict," amplified through helm, "halt the oathwalk. The pact is void if interference." The second bell cut off mid-peal, as if held by a giant hand. Silence struck, sharp as a blade. Jace shifted his weight. "Your Majesty," he said lightly, "how do you feel about dancing under pressure?" "Show me," she said. They moved, not graceful, not trained, but together, pivoting as the warden lunged, the mantle whipping into his visor with a crack of reactive lace that discharged a harmless but spectacular blossom of sparks. The crowd screamed delight. The councillor's staff struck the floor, chains rattling a sanction. "Third bell approaches," she called, voice thin. Jace met the Queen's eyes, their wrists still connected, a pulse sinking by accident or design. "We either deny loudly," he said, "or we kiss louder." The Queen's mouth curved and the wind leaned in to hear. The third bell inhaled to strike. The warden lowered his shoulder to break their link, and the veil itself brightened, choosing a side. The third bell hit like a comet in a bowl, resonance shaking banners loose from their pins. The Ember Veil ignited along the skyway's edges, a border of foxfire red that painted their joined hands in living lore. "Interference voids nothing," the Queen said, louder, formal cadence stitching words into record. "Only cowardice does." The warden's charge faltered under a roar from the promenade. Even helmets hesitated before a city deciding to enjoy itself. Jace stepped, led and spun, half dance, half evasive footwork learned in markets where knives watched. "Left," he murmured, and she moved with him, mantle cracking like a pennant in stormlight. "Spectacle," she reminded, breath warm on his cheek. "Then we give them a headline," he said, and dipped her just enough for the veil to arc between them in a bridge of light. The city lost its mind. Banners fell. Coins chimed across stone like metallic rain. "Majesty," the councillor called, forcing poise through panic. "Invoke Clause 12, public proof without consummation. A kiss suffices." The Queen laughed, delighted and dangerous. Jace's grin was all apology and mischief. "Permission to follow local customs?" "Granted," she said, and the word was a key. They kissed, not possessive, not tentative, a seal pressed with the authority of a city listening. The veil cascaded in ripples of crimson, each wave sketching luminous glyphs that spiraled outward to the bridges and towers. The warden lowered his weapon in reflexive awe. "Record shows," intoned the councillor despite herself. "Ember pact affirmed." Cheers broke like surf. Then, because no victory survives unbothered, 3 additional figures stepped onto the far rail, women in armor of differing cuts, each wearing variations of the Queen's crest. The veil surged again, this time sketching not a circle, but a lattice of interlocking rings that spanned from the Queen's mantle to the newcomer's gorgets. The councillor sagged. "Oh," she said faintly. "Of course." Jace blinked. "Of course what?" The tallest newcomer, wolf smile, hair like burnished steel, tapped her gorget. "Clause 15, she recited with a soldier's relish. "Where the monarch's mantle bears the triune crest during the veil, any pact entered extends protective ward and marital claim to the reigning triad. Sisters by oath, crowns by rotation." Jace looked at the Queen. She didn't look away. "We share sovereignty," she said softly. "We also share vows." The second sister, eyes like storm glass, scholar's fingers ink-stained even in armor, raised a palm. "We are not a harem," she said dryly. "We are a government. The law prevents concentration by bloodline and ensures redundancy of heart." The third, smallest, with a captain's braids and a grin that promised trouble, saluted Jace with 2 fingers. "Congratulations," she said. "You just married the set." The crowd went from cheering to shrieking gossip in a heartbeat. Jace rubbed the bridge of his nose with his free hand. "I patched a hem," he said. "Now I'm state infrastructure." "Beloved," the Queen said, savoring the first use of the term with predatory grace. "This is the part where you either run or stand taller." He considered the sky, red and singing. Then he turned to the warden, who still hovered like a punctuation mark left over from a previous sentence. "By local statute," Jace said, voice steady as a measuring tape, "as consort under veil, I claim right of passage for my bonded to finish the oath walk uninterrupted. Object, and be seen." The warden very wisely stepped back. The 4 women aligned, Queen center, sisters flanking, and Jace at her wrist, the sigil lace making a single story out of 5 pulses. They moved as one across the last span. Coins chimed again, this time intentional. The city tipping. At the final plinth, the councillor lifted her chains, face unreadable. "Ember pact affirmed," she repeated, "pending completion of the hearthrite before nightfall." Jace blinked. There's always a post-credit scene. Does Hearthrite, the scholar sister explained, calm. 5 oaths before a living flame. Each oath unlocks a seal on the mantle. All 5, or the pact falls to cinders at moonrise. And the seals? Jace asked, because disasters are friendlier when named. Duty, mercy, wit, trust, courage, the captain's sister recited, in any order, under eyes that do not blink. The Queen looked at Jace the way a horizon looks at a ship deciding its route. Walk with us to the hearth, she said. He squeezed her wrist back. The smallest yes. The veil dimmed a fraction, like a held breath. At the hearth's gate, a figure in Cosmetech livery waited, contract in hand, smiling like a knife, claws inked in the margins. If any oath fails, custody transfers to the highest bidder. The hearth gate rose like a rib carved from a meteor, its inner arch packed with living coals that exhaled heat in measured breaths. Each exhale bent flames toward whoever spoke truth, or away when lies soured the air. Cosmetech's envoy waited beneath the arch, wearing a smile that fit like a stolen face. His suit shimmered with non-disclosure runes that crawled when you looked too long. Majesty consort, he purred, offering a parchment grown from vat pulp and embedded with witness fibers. A friendly reminder, should any of the 5 oaths fail before moonrise, custody of the Ember Mantle defaults to the highest bonded creditor currently holding lien on the palace armory. The captain's sister's fingers twitched near her sword. We don't owe you, she said, voice even, eyes not. The envoy's smile widened by one tooth. Not me, the council's shadow ledger, which, alas, doesn't cast votes, but does cast very long claws. Jace stepped half a pace forward, subtle enough to read as etiquette, obvious enough to block the man's angle on the Queen. We're here to make oaths, not haggle, he said. If you need to be seen, stand to the side. If you need to be heard, write it down. The scholar sister's mouth quirked. Approval, dry as parchment. The hearth measures intent, she murmured. Let the flames decide what belongs. The envoy bowed with theatrical humility and slid aside, parchment still visible like a smug flag. Inside, the hearth chamber glowed copper and wine dark, every surface etched with stories of couples who had managed 5 vows in a single dusk. The gaps between stories were cooler stone, the ones who hadn't. Order can shift, the scholar said, but each oath raises the mantle seal. Fail any, and all fall. Start with the obvious, Jace suggested. Duty. The Queen faced the coals. Their breath leaned toward her like dogs toward a trusted hand. By the veil and the city that breathes it, she said, I hold duty to people before throne, to truth before convenience, and to this pact before the whisper of those who were not chosen. Flames surged, shaping a brief crown around her words, then sank into the mantle's first clasp, which clicked with the sound of a lock relieved. The crowd gathered in the portico, wardens, courtiers, citizens craning over each other's shoulders, exhaled as if granted permission. Mercy, the Queen said softer. To the self I was, to the enemies I will make human when I can, and to this human who did not come here to be a law, but to become a person within it. The second clasp warmed and opened, heat radiating like a satisfied animal. The envoy tisked a bare breath. 3 to go, he murmured, voice pitched for them and for the ledger listening through the parchment's fibers. Wit, Jace said, before nervousness could pick his pockets. If that one fails, we deserve repossession. The captain snorted. The scholar hid a smile, and even the councillor's chains did something like a chuckle. The Queen tilted her head. Wit? Jace faced the fire. By the hooks and hollows, where city wind gets stuck, he said. I'll keep laughter in our house when the world is a bad joke told badly. I'll make spectacle when the crowd needs courage and silence into a punchline when secrets would wound. The fire licked his knuckles without burning, tasting the shape of the promise. The third class popped with a musical ping that bounced around the chamber and out to the portico, where cheers caught it and threw it higher. Trust, the scholar prompted, but her eyes had slid to the envoy, who was now thumbing a second parchment. Smaller, meaner, its fibers darker like something bruised. Trust, the Queen echoed, gaze on Jace. In council when I cannot be gentle, in him when I cannot be brave, and in my sisters when I cannot be enough. The fourth clasp trembled, opened halfway, then stalled as if some cold logic had gripped it. The envoy's smaller parchment unfurled by itself like a venomous fern. "Objection," he said mildly, and the runes sank into the floor, crawling toward the hearth's bed. New evidence. The council registered a motion to suspend the triune crest an hour before the oath walk. If there is no triad, then there is no shared trust to swear, and your clasp doesn't know what shape it belongs to. The flames recoiled, confused. Heat tugged away from their joined wrists in a slow, pained breath. The councillor's chains rasped across stone. "They moved to unseat the sisters," she whispered, scandalized not by the audacity, but by the paperwork's timing. "Moonrise approaches," the envoy reminded. "If trust fails, courage cannot save you." Jace's laugh was small and stubborn. "That's not how courage works." He turned, displaying his hands to the city beyond the arch, to the cameras without lenses, the watching veil, the listening stone. "If the law can yank chairs out from under people mid-oath, then the law is a stage magician with worse ethics," he said. "Trust is not a roster. It's the act of leaning when your knees shake." He faced the sisters. "Lean," he said. "On me, on each other. Now in public, before the third clasp decides it believes in paperwork more than people." The captain moved first, hand to his shoulder with battlefield certainty. The scholar followed, palm over the mantle's edge, ink-stained fingers smudging gold with human imperfection. The queen stepped between their hands and Jace's wrist, making a bridge of flesh and fabric and intent. Heat swung back like a door slamming inward. The fourth clasp opened with a bright, relieved sound. The envoy's smile didn't break. He simply pointed upward, where the sky beyond the oculus paled, moonrise bleeding early, as if bought. The moon's rim crested the oculus a full quarter-hour early, silver like a coin thrown by a creditor. Even the glass throats in the city's windows changed pitch, unnerved by a sky that didn't obey its own clock. "Time manipulation?" The scholar breathed, horror threaded with professional curiosity. "Or the registry lied about when the moon counts as risen," the councillor said tightly. "Words are clocks when you write them into law." "Courage," Jace said, to cut the rising tangle. "We finish on our feet." The envoy spread his hands. "By all means, but if you fail by the ledger's minute, your courage will be collateral." The captain's sister squared to the coals. "By every bridge I've held and every name I've had shouted at me in retreat," she said. "I'll step forward when orders say stall, speak when silence is a wound, and remain when leaving would be applauded." The hearth answered, not with a neat click, but a flare that roared up the mantle's spine. The final clasp shone, almost, but did not open. "Why?" the queen demanded, heat cutting the word. The scholar's eyes tracked the envoy's parchment, then the high arch, where early moonlight carved a false halo. "Because courage is not just declared," she said softly. "It's witnessed. Spectacle," the queen murmured, looking to Jace, memory flickering of a skyway dance, and a kiss that turned physics into press coverage. "Give them a reason to cheer," Jace said, voice almost a smile, almost a dare. The envoy's suit clicked, micro-locks arming as if the notion of courage offended. Two wardens stepped from the portico shadows, H6 lattice whining, ordered by a signal no one gave out loud. "Object and be seen," Jace had said earlier. Now the objection came armored. He slid across one step of polished stone, putting the mantle's edge between the wardens and the queen, and lifted his hands, not to fight, but to invite eyes. "Olyssar," he called, voice riding the hearth's breath. "If law is a mirror, let it show us now." The first warden lunged. The queen did not flinch. The sisters did not step back. Jace turned the lunge with nothing but angle and audacity, guiding the warden's momentum past the mantle so the H6 lattice struck the stone where the envoy's venom parchment had been unfurling. Sparks spat, burning the claws to curling black. The second warden hesitated, only a breath, only a blink, but Olyssar saw it. The crowd's sound shifted from gasp to decision. Coins began to ring again, not from pockets, but from balconies. Citizens throwing money at the moment as if funding the outcome. "Courage witnessed," the scholar said, voice steady now, carrying like a bell. The final clasp's light sharpened. The envoy stepped backward, calculations spilling out of his eyes like ink in rain. Even if you finish, he hissed, the smile finally cracking, the lien remains. We will take what the law allows. Jace tilted his head. Then let's make the law allow less. He turned to the counselor. Chainkeeper, how does a city amend itself without waiting for a scribe? Her knuckles whitened on the staff. A popular seal, she said reluctantly. If 10,000 citizens witness a rite and answer with coin or mark, the act binds custom to code for one dusk. Coins kept falling, tinkling like rain in a metal forest. Fingers pressed inked thumbs to the portico pillars, leaving smears of agreement. The veil outside rippled as if counting. Then hear the last oath, the queen said, turning to the fire that already leaned toward her like a lover eager for the end of a story. By the breath of Olyssar and the weight of its watching, I swear to set law to serve the living, not ledger, to bind lenders by the same rope they toss to bind us, to make spectacle into statute when justice needs a crowd. The hearth erupted, no other word, casting glyphs high enough to kiss the oculus. The moonlight bent through them and changed color from cold coin to warm copper. The final clasp opened with a sweet, decisive sound, and the mantle settled on the queen's shoulders as if it had been waiting centuries to belong. The envoy stared at the pillars now black with thumbprints, at the coins still ringing, at a city writing itself by hand. Popular seal, he whispered, as if it tasted like losing. Article 0, the counselor added, voice suddenly young. When spectacle becomes statute for the good of the governed. Jace let out a breath he hadn't admitted he was holding. We did it, he said, soft enough that only the queen could hear, loud enough that the hearth could count it. She leaned not to claim but to share, their foreheads almost touching in the heat. We began, she corrected. From the archway, boots retreated, the wardens choosing future over order for one night. The envoy, however, did not flee. He lifted the original lean parchment and smiled a new smile, the kind you only practice when you think you've found a back door. He turned the parchment, revealing a sigil burned into the reverse, a private crest shaped like a fox's grin with human teeth. Cosmetech's owner sends her regards, he said. Your first creditor is a queen. The crest on the lean parchment wasn't a logo, so much as a warning dressed in heraldry, a fox's grin with human teeth, lacquered in heat, black and blood bright, stamped into the fibre so deep the pulp around it shivered. The counselor's chains slid, a sound like rain tamed into obedience. Private crest, she said, hushed, not filed with the registry, which is illegal unless your name outranks the law. Does it? Jace asked. The envoy smiled as if given a personal compliment. Names are of limited utility here, he said lazily. Titles, however, can move mountains and time. The queen stepped into moon-bent light, mantle absorbing copper and giving back ember. Which title? She asked. Speak it, so the hearth can hear who thinks it owns Olyssar. The envoy obliged with theatrical clarity, sovereign executor of Cosmetech Holdings, her radiant patron of adaptive biology, and, by contract of annexed succession, Queen Regent of Vashtir. The word Vashtir fell like a memory with teeth, the city that birthed queens with foxfire in their veins, the rival whose marble gates glowed like carved moonlight. The captain's hand found her hilt. That crown belongs to bloodlines, not ledgers, she said. An easy mistake, the envoy replied. Cosmetech doesn't buy crowns, it bankrolls rituals. When rituals write crowns, accounting reads them. The scholar's brow furrowed. Annexed succession, she repeated. A clause that lets an external sovereign underwrite a neighbor's right in exchange for emergency stewardship, if the right falters. Stewardship, the queen echoed, tasting the euphemism. Custody. Jace felt the room tilt. Not physically, but in the way gossip tilts a crowd before a stampede. So, if our pact had failed, your Queen Regent steps in to protect Olyssar, and perhaps collect a few favors. Only what law allows, the envoy said, as if law were a neutral weather system and not a sky he'd been painting. The counselor's chains tightened. Then we have two roads, she said. Contest the lien in the registry's labyrinth, or render annexed succession irrelevant by making our pact untouchable in custom. Custom, the queen said at once. Spectacle, Jace added, because language that had worked twice deserved a trilogy. The scholar's lips curved. A city's habits are harder to foreclose than its assets. The envoy's smirk cooled. Habits can be broken. People break, he said. For instance, when presented with an impossible choice. He snapped gloved fingers. From the hearth-side door, wardens ushered in a small procession. Artisans with burn-scarred hands, market women with coin-heavy aprons, a boy with a cracked instrument whose glass reed still sang faintly. Collateral, the envoy said softly, not taken, merely gathered. Should Olyssar's treasury resist lawful collection, private creditors may satisfy claims via voluntary tithe. The captain's face drained. You're shaking down the city in public. Inspiring generosity, he corrected. Do finish your celebration. I wouldn't dream of interrupting a new marriage with arithmetic. Jace's jaw flexed. If law is theater, you picked the wrong audience for a tragedy, he said. We prefer comedies with knives. The Queen touched his wrist, once, grounding. We won the right, she murmured. Now we win the narrative. She stepped onto the portico rail, as if borne on edges, mantle a living standard. Olyssar, she called, voice spreading like heat. A neighbor claims the right to hold your hand when you trip. You can give that hand, or you can lace fingers with mine. Hands rose from the crowd, palms inked from earlier marks, fingers stained with work and spice, all angled toward the hearth as if it were a sun. The scholar lifted a tome from the shelf that was not a shelf, but a stack of fused contracts. Popular seal can do more than amend, she said. It can forbid. Article 0, the counselor breathed. Again, Article 0b, the scholar said, eyes bright. When a city has already bound spectacle to statute in a dusk, it may append a prohibition that lasts until dawn. No stewardship by external tithe while popular seal remains warm. The envoy's expression slipped to something nearer to human. Where did you... Footnote, the scholar said sweetly. Fine print saves lives. Jace leaned toward the Queen. We need a show that writes itself into the footnote, he whispered. Something only we can do, the captain said. Something only Olyssar can witness, the scholar added. The Queen smiled, slow and carnivorous. Then let's light the bridges. The bone bridges began to hum, glass throats retuned by unseen hands as the Queen raised her mantle, preparing a city-wide rite no ledger had priced. Olyssar's bridges had names: Far Rib, Choir Spine, Widow's Span, each arch a bone from giants the city pretended were metaphors. Tonight, their names felt like throats. The Queen stepped onto the far rib with Jace at her wrist and the sisters at her flanks. Beneath, the Ember Veil swirled thicker, answering the mantle's glow like iron to a magnet. Article 0b demands a prohibition witnessed by the same 10,000, the scholar called over her shoulder, walking backward with a ledger quill in hand. So give them something to answer. Cosmetech thinks in liens, the captain said. We'll think in lines. Lines, Jace asked. Of people, she said, and whistled. From alleys and courtyards, citizens flowed onto bridges in two living rivers, forming lanes that converged toward the hearth. Vendors hoisted braziers. Musicians lifted glass reeds. Children carried inkstones like holy things. The Queen lifted the mantle, and glyphs spilled like red gold thread, stringing from her shoulders to the nearest arch. The veil like spectacle, she said. Let it count hands that refuse to be collateral. The first chant rose, not words, but the vowel of a city remembering it had lungs. The glass throats caught it, bent it, returned it as harmony. Jace felt the note settle under his sternum. This is either genius or how we invent crowd crush, he muttered. Trust, the Queen said, and the word had new weight now that the clasp for it sat open on her shoulder. They walked. As they passed, citizens pressed thumbprints to the rails, coin to the stone, voice to the air. Popular seal warmed not just pillars, but planks and ribs, a city-wide fever writing itself. The envoy kept pace at a distance, smile gone mathematical, fingers dancing along a wrist console as if trying to price the unpriceable. Wardens flanked him but did not step into the current of people. At the midpoint of Widow's Span, a hush fell, the kind that anticipates vows or executions. The Queen stopped, turned and spoke without raising her voice. The bridges carried it anyway. "Vashtir taught me law as theatre," she said. "Tonight, Olyssar teaches me theatre as law." She drew a circle in the air with the mantle's edge. Glyphs spun, then froze, a ring bright enough to etch after images into eyelids. "By popular seal still warm, Olyssar forbids stewardship by foreign tithe until dawn," she intoned. "All who agree, mark." The city answered with noise and ink and money, thumbprints layered into black-red mosaics, coins stacked like tiny towers, names shouted and sung. Heat rolled outward. The envoy lifted his parchment as if to shield himself from rain. "Prohibitions expire at dawn," he said loudly, hoping the crowd would hear limits as inevitabilities. "Dawn buys us a night," Jace answered, voice pitched for him and for the 100 watchers who would repeat it. "A night is where people change." The captain unsheathed her blade, not to threaten, but to reflect the glyph light so it painted the envoy's face with the city's will. "Tell your regent she can rent the moon," she said. "She can't rent our breath." Laughter rippled, then settled into a new chant, sharper, easier to remember. "Our breath." The scholar ticked a final box on the ledger page. "Article 0B appended," she called, voice bright with adrenaline and ink. "Prohibition bound until dawn." The bridges exhaled, a physical sensation, as if the city had been bracing and now let go. Lantern light steadied, the veil smoothed like a massive animal stroked. Jace leaned into the queen, forehead to temple for one heartbeat. "What does she actually want?" he asked, eyes on the envoy. "Queens don't buy cities for coin," the queen murmured. "They buy stories to make their crowns fit." As if summoned by the line, a new sound sliced the harmony, a sleek, predatory engine cutting the air. A skiff, painted in Vashtir's marble and foxfire livery, drifted above the far plaza, and aboard it stood a figure wearing a veil brighter than the veil itself. "Her radiant regent," the envoy said softly, relief and dread braided, like a servant whose master had finally come home to check the work. The figure lifted one hand. The crowd's chant tangled and died as instinct hushed the mouth. A voice, amplified by nothing and heard by everyone, filled the bridges, familiar because it was the voice of every good story told in Vashtir. "Beloved sister," said the Regent Queen, "return what you borrowed, your city's heart. If you love HFY where law bends to living people, tap the den and stay. Tonight Olyssar writes its own sequel." The herald's voice threaded the bridges as the Regent Queen's skiff drifted to a measured halt above the plaza, its hull a ripple of marble white chased with foxfire veins. She wore no crown, only a veil bright enough to make the Ember Veil look shy. When she lifted her hand, the city's chant softened on instinct, like surf recognizing a moon. "Beloved sister," the Regent said, and the word had edges. "Return what you borrowed, your city's heart." The Queen of Olyssar did not bow. The mantle on her shoulders was still warm from Article 0B and the 5 oaths. The sigil lace at her wrist still hummed, where Jace's pulse met hers. "You can't repossess a heartbeat," she answered evenly. "You can only try to scare it into a different rhythm." The envoy, lower on the portico, looked up with the relief of a bureaucrat who'd summoned a thunderstorm and watched it arrive on schedule. "Your radiance," he called. "The lien breathes," the regent finished without looking at him. Her eyes, gold-cut with iron, studied the mantle's glow, then the bridges, then the blackened pillars, thumb-printed with popular seal. Interesting law, untidy, brave. Jace stepped to the rail with the sisters flanking. "If you came to test the wells," he said, "the cities already leaned on them. They held." The regent's gaze slid to him, curious as a predator facing a new animal. Human, not an insult. An observation catalogued among other data points. Vashtir teaches that ritual is scaffolding for power. Olyssar teaches that ritual is theater for people. Both are true. Both can be bought, if one knows what currency the stage accepts. "Oh, tonight the stage accepts coins and ink and breath," the captain said, hand on hilt but blade low, a soldier's politeness before war. "And tomorrow?" the regent asked. "When dawn cools your seal, when accountants return like tide." The scholar balanced her ledger against her hip, ink smudges like constellations. "Then we do what law schools forget and folk tales remember. We repeat the right story until it becomes a rule people can't imagine not having. A small sound cut the debate. The glass reed of the boy with the cracked instrument, trying to hold a note while the grown world spoke. The tune wavered, found itself, and steadied, a thin, stubborn line. The Regent listened, head tilted. Olyssar's heart, she murmured, not borrowed, singing over debt. She lowered her hand. Her veil dimmed a fraction, as if conceding a point. Very well, one night for your song. The envoy flinched. Your radiance, the annexed succession, is a door, not a leash, she said, colder now, and doors can be closed when the house is awake. Her gaze returned to the Queen. If you keep the house awake. Jace leaned in without looking away from the skiff. Translation, he said under breath. She won't cross a city that's looking back. She'll wait for dawn, with better lawyers. Then we keep them looking, the Queen murmured. She stepped forward, mantle catching the Ember Veil's light and bending it into glyphs that ran along Widow's span like red gold water. Olyssar, choice time. Do we dance or discuss fine print? Dance, the city answered, a laugh threaded with defiance. Music rose, not the curated grandeur of court, but alleys and workshops joining in, drums on crates, flutes cut from conduit, a chorus built from yes. The sisters moved in, forming a diamond with the Queen and Jace as the point, a geometry that made space where there was none. Footwork, the Queen asked, eyes gleaming. Follow and smile, Jace said. We're being televised by physics again. He stepped, turned, let the crowd's wave carry them forward, while his free hand turned an oncoming warden with the gentle insistence one uses on a drunk friend leaving a party. The Regent watched, veil flickering, expression not displeased. Her skiff matched the procession's pace without casting shadow over it. On the portico, the envoy's wrist console ticked through models that refused to converge. At choir spine, the Queen stopped and lifted the mantle high. Glyphs poured upward and fused into a ring that hung over the bridge like a second oculus. Vashtir, she called, turning to face the skiff. Lend us your best lore. We'll return it improved. A ripple ran through the crowd at the boldness. The Regent's teeth flashed, surprised into a smile that didn't look rehearsed. Name it! The Trial of Hands, the captain said at once, eyes on the warden lines where helmets hid expressions. Old Vashtir custom. When rulers disagree, they send champions to demonstrate whose law safeguards better. Trial doesn't decide treaty, the scholar cautioned. It decides narrative, which is what she came to buy, Jace said. We price it high. He lifted their joined wrists. 5 hands, 5 oaths. We pick challenges that prove them. You pick your 5. Clever, the Regent mused. And fair, if you don't cheat. The envoy found his voice. Your radiance, this is irregular. And binding if enough eyes approve. The Regent finished, glancing at the living sea of witnesses. Olyssar? The answer was thunder folded into applause. Then let's begin, the Regent said, and foxfire crawled along her sleeves as she gestured. 5 figures stepped forward from the skiff's aft, Vashtir champions wearing different cuts of power, a jurist with a veil of text, a dancer with bells at ankles, a warden captain, a whisper priest, and a child carrying a lantern whose flame didn't flicker. The child lifted the lantern, and the light didn't waver in the wind at all. First hand, the Regent said. Trust. The Queen's fingers tightened on Jace's wrist. He squeezed back once. The scholar stepped to the line, ink-stained, steady. Accepted, she said, and set her palm above the lantern's calm flame. We'll prove it in front of a fire that refuses to lie. The lantern's light arced toward her, as if hearing. The jurist extended a scroll that began writing itself in fire letters, clause by clause, as 2 cities held their breath. A hush rolled outward wide and bright, and the bridges leaned forward in their bones to listen. A bell far off counted a minute neither side owned, and the lantern flame tilted the thickness of a hair toward the scholar's hand. As the scroll's first line finished itself in words both cities could read. The first line glowed. Trust is the art of leaning at the edge of falling. False leaning scorches the hand. The jurist's veil fluttered with letters, and the lantern did something no fire should. It listened visually, its surface tightening like skin aware of eyes. Question, the jurist said, voice two-toned, the way people sound in domes where speech comes back as law. Does Olyssar trust its triad because they are crown, or because they are human enough to lean first? The scholar didn't look at the crowd, the regent, or even the queen. She looked at Jace's hand over the mantle edge, at the ink on her own fingers, at the boy's cracked reed, trembling and proud. Because they lean first, she answered. We follow what moves toward us when it could move away. The lantern flared toward her palm, not to burn, but to warm. The scroll's second line wrote itself, answered in conduct. Vashtir, the regent called, letting the word be a challenge and a caress both. The whisper priest stepped forward, voice small enough to force silence into cupping it. Do you trust your human? He asked the queen without ornament. The queen didn't blink. With the part of me that won't forgive myself if I don't, she said. That is where trust lives. The lantern's flame leaped like a dog recognizing its name, and the scroll stamped a sigil. Witnessed. The jurist inclined her head. Point to Olyssar. Second hand, the regent said smoothly. Wit. The dancer with the ankle bells smiled. A knife made of delight. Make a crowd laugh while your enemy arms, she said, and flicked her wrist. 3 H6 wardens rose onto the bridge edges, lattice humming, their visors set to intimidate. Jace took a breath that tasted like dust and music. Wardens, he called. Thank you for volunteering. He bowed. Watch your step, the city's looking. He turned to the audience, stage whisper loud. In Vashtir, armor comes with a warranty on dignity. We'll try not to void it. Snorts rippled through the crowd. Even one warden's stance softened a hair. Jace spun the mantle's spare edge out, not to trip, but to invite a misstep, then flowed with the dancer in a half-mock duet that made the wardens part to avoid looking like bad choreography. Laughter rose, warm and unwilling. The dancers' bells rang a cadence that meant approval in half the markets Jace had ever survived. The jurist's veil wrote, Wit disarms without drawing blood. The lantern leaned, the regent's mouth tilted, conceding a second mark. Third, the regent said. Mercy. The whisper priest extended a palm toward the envoy. What do you do with a man who shook coins over a crowd? The captain's jaw set. The scholar's quill paused. The queen's eyes were swords half-sheathed. Jace exhaled. You put him where numbers help, under eyes that won't let him hide, he said. Ledger in public, salary posted, authority 0, and you make him teach the next child who wants to be him how not to be. Murmurs surged, then steadied into something like approval, the city recognizing a punishment that tasted like work, not spectacle. The lantern warmed without flaring. The scroll inscribed, Mercy measured is justice taught. Fourth, the regent said, Duty. The warden captain from the skiff stepped into the ring and saluted Olyssar's queen with textbook precision. Duty is obeying ugly orders, she said. Behoove yours without applause. Olyssar's captain didn't move to center stage. She turned to a knot of wardens at the periphery and said simply, Stand down from the crowd line. Pair with the vendors. Put your bodies where the small will be crushed if we fail. No flourish, no shout, just a redistribution of force. The regent watched the motion ripple, armor leaving the spotlight and entering the load-bearing seams. The jurist's veil wrote, Duty shifts weight from the loved to the needed. The lantern bowed toward the Olyssar captain's quiet command. Last hand, the regent said, and let herself smile openly now, a flash of teeth that was almost joy. Courage. She nodded to the child with the lantern. He stepped into the dead center of Widow's span, small as a sentence that changes a book. The flame didn't flicker. Walk across the ring while your enemy chooses which plank to remove, she said to Jace. The envoy brightened, hungry. Select a plank, he said, licking one thumb to flip his venom parchment to a page that felt like a trap. Jace looked at the queen's wrist against his, at the sisters' stances angled to catch him if he fell, at 10,000 eyes holding him up with interest and stubbornness. No plank, he said. We don't play the whole game. He took the lantern from the child, put it in the exact center of the ring, and stepped back to the edge. I'll walk the rail instead. A hiss ran through the crowd. Fears inhale. The rail was the width of a palm. Wind made it narrower. The regent's head tilted, a fraction of admiration like the knock of a ring on wood. do it looking at me," she said softly. "So you can't pretend the fall is the wind's fault." Jace smiled because he had to. "Deal." He put one foot on the rail, then the next, eyes on the foxfire veil, not on the drop. The city hushed until the only sound was glass throats holding their breath. Halfway the envoy twitched a finger, some petty attempt to startle. The mantle's sigil lace pulsed once against Jace's skin. The queen's hand didn't tighten, didn't reach, didn't steal the choice. She trusted, the first oath echoing into the last. Jace reached the other side, toes finding stone, as if it had always been there. He turned, bowed to the lantern first, then to the regent, then to the crowd that had not breathed for 20 heartbeats. The jurist's veil wrote the final line with a flourish it hadn't allowed itself all night. Courage convinces the witness before it comforts the actor. The lantern's light bloomed until the ring was a sun, and the regent's skiff cast no shadow at all. The regent exhaled, and it sounded like relief in a language that didn't like to admit having that word. "Vashtir recognizes Olyssar's trial of hands," she said, "and retires her claim for one dawn more." She looked at the envoy the way a queen looks at a tool she's about to put back in a box. "Do not embarrass me by confusing hunger with right." The skiff began to turn, foxfire dulling as if courtesy required it. The crowd's sound surged back, messy and human and alive. Jace leaned his shoulder to the queen's, a small collision that felt like a decision. The envoy did not leave. He lifted a third parchment, thinner, older, its fibers threaded with something that made the Ember Veil recoil the width of a breath. "There's one currency you didn't price," he said, voice gaining a terrible confidence. "Bloodline." He turned the page so both cities could see the seal at its bottom, a marriage contract pre-signed on a night-long past, in a hand that matched the queen's. A signature glowed, the same curve as the queen's name, but beside it another name in a script Olyssar did not know and Vashtir would never forget. "Consummation deferred," the envoy read. "Payment due at dawn." A voice, amplified by nothing and heard by everyone, cut through the ring of light, and it carried the exact cadence of the queen's when she laughed. "Tell them who signed it with me, envoy," said the voice from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Or shall I step onto the bridge and collect my bride?" Sound doesn't always enter by the ears. Sometimes it arrives as recognition, a shape you've stored in bone before meeting it in air. The voice that rolled across Widow's span had the queen's timbre, stripped of restraint and mixed with foxfire, as if the same throat had learned two cities. The regent's skiff halted mid-turn. Her veil brightened, then steadied, a predator putting away surprise like a blade. The envoy's grin returned in full, performer re-centered by his cue. He held the parchment higher, so the seal at its bottom caught the ring's sunlight. Two entwined crests burned into the fiber, Olyssar's rib bridge and Vashtir's fox flare. "Name the co-signer," the queen said, voice even as falling ash. The envoy inhaled the moment like perfume. "Her radiant Sarenvora of Vashtir," he announced. "By that night's record pledged to you, triad-born, under the clause of deferred union, pending the Ember Veil's choosing." A current of shock moved the crowd without pushing bodies. People don't part for news, they lean. Jace felt the lean like a tide against his calves. He looked at the queen and saw no panic, only memory aligning like stars. "Triad-born," the scholar murmured, snapping open a memory as if it were a book. "When the Olyssar mantle is held by sisters under the triune crest, any engagement binds to the three, not to one. If the veil later names a mate, the prior contract either dissolves cleanly or converts," the captain finished, jaw set, "into alliance." The regent's eyes flicked once toward the skiff's stern, where a second figure stepped into view. A woman tall where the queen was tall, veiled the way lightning veils itself in storm. Her silhouette, a hotline drawn by someone who loved the pen. Sarenvora's veil didn't glow, it smoldered. "Olyssar," Sarenvora said, and the city heard its name as if spoken by a cousin you haven't seen since the fight at a wedding. "I signed when your sisters were children. We were children. We thought we could outright fathers." The queen's mouth tilted, humor and steel threaded. "We were right about that part." Sarenvora's laugh curled like smoke. But we were wrong about what we'd become. I came to collect a promise where it still fits, if you'll let me resize it." The envoy stiffened. "Your radiance, the lean." "Be quiet," both queens said, not in unison but in harmony, which is worse for the person being quieted. Jace angled closer to the queen, voice barely air. "Is this the woman who taught you to weaponize ceremony? She taught me to treat ceremony like a knife you also use to eat," the queen said, "and to sharpen both sides." Sarenvora stepped to the skiff's rail, veil slipping back enough to show a mouth shaped for decrees and laughter in equal ratios. "Deferred union has 2 doors, she said, pitching her voice so that law could not claim it hadn't heard. "Marriage, if the veil aligns hearts later, or alliance, if it aligns cities instead. Tonight your veil chose a wrist, mine chooses a border." The scholar's quill scratched once. "If both sovereigns declare alliance chosen, the marriage clause evaporates, and the lean can't leverage bloodline," she breathed. "But you must state it in the ritual space that birthed the clause. The oath walk," the captain realized. "Not the hearth, not the bridges, the exact plinth." The regent said nothing, but her gaze sharpened as if tasting the same page. Sarenvora's head tilted. Foxfire flickered along her sleeve in patterns that looked like laughter learning math. "Then we walk," she said simply. The envoy tried to speak. Wardens moved to obey a signal their bodies had been trained to anticipate. Jace raised his free hand, palm out to the nearest helmet. "Olyssar is watching," he said. "Vashtir is watching. If you put your back to either, you will remember it in your sleep for the rest of your useful life." The warden paused, one breath too, and lowered his arm. The queen nodded once to Sarenvora across the gap. "We start at far rib, meet at center." "Like we didn't the first time," Sarenvora said, and stepped lightly off the skiff onto a sister bridge whose ribs were marble instead of bone. Its foxfire rail hummed like a threat, tuned into a promise. The procession split, Olyssar's queen and her triad taking the leftward span, Sarenvora and 2 officers of Vashtir taking the right. The Ember Veil thickened between, as if eager to be painted with a different story than annexation. Jace leaned close enough that the queen could have borrowed his breath. "Why didn't you tell me there was someone whose name could add itself to yours?" "Because names are cliffs," she said, "and I needed you to walk a rail." He huffed a laugh that wasn't humor and wasn't not. "Honest. Always," she said, and for once Law didn't need a fire to confirm it. They reached the Oathwalk's plinth. Its blackwood gleamed with the memory of earlier audacity. On the other side, Sarenvora stepped onto Vashtir's twin plinth. Same geometry, different material, a mirror with a scar. "Speak it clean," the scholar urged from behind. "No flourishes for clerks to argue." The queen lifted her chin. "By the veil and the watchers of 2 cities, Olyssar chooses alliance where marriage was deferred." Sarenvora mirrored her posture, her voice dovetailing so the words became a braid. "By foxfire and bone bridge, Vashtir chooses alliance where marriage was deferred." The ember veil between them pulsed once like a living thing agreeing. The seals on the old parchment hissed. The bottom edge curled like a leaf that realized it had been pressed too long. The envoy gripped it harder, knuckles pale. Something shifted high above. The moon, which had been rented by Ledger, returned to its honest arc. The glass throat's pitch corrected. Coins stopped falling because people had forgotten to throw them. They were using their hands to hold each other instead. The regent's veil dimmed to courtesy. She inclined her head, not to the envoy, not even to the law, but to the 2 women who had just pulled a clause apart and tied it into a bridge. "Vashtir stands down," she said. "For as long as Olyssar stands together." The envoy's smile finally died. He folded the parchment like it might forgive him if he made it small. Then he unfolded another page. No seal, no crest, just handwriting in a language the veil didn't recognize. He began to read it anyway. The queen's eyes narrowed. "Foreign law," she said softly, "imported like a disease." The scholar's breath caught. "Adaptive clauses," she whispered. "Cosmetech's true specialty. Contracts that eat other contracts." A ripple of cold ran the length of the bridge, the kind that knows how to find wrists. Adaptive clauses don't trumpet, they seep. The envoy read in a cadence that sounded like rain learning grammar, and as he spoke, the ink on Olyssar's pillars shivered as if something thirsty had remembered it had lips. The black-red mosaics of thumbprints mottled lighter, then darker, then lighter again. "What language is that?" the captain demanded. The scholar's face had gone pale, the way paper goes before fire, all fibers visible. "Not language," she said. "Protocol. It binds by observation. If enough witnesses fail to understand, it claims the right to define meaning." "Then we explain it faster than it eats," Jace said. "Loud!" He stepped onto the rail. Again, because once you've done a trick for survival, it becomes a habit, and raised their joined wrists. "Olyssar!" His voice rode the city's harmonic bones. "That thing he's reading is a parasite. It says if you don't know the rules, it gets to write them. So here are our rules. In words 6-year-olds can throw like stones. No one owns our breath. No one rents our dawn. No one moves our moon." Children picked up the chant at once. Adults followed, because pride hates being slower than kids at saving home. The glass throats re-tuned themselves to the new syllables. The Ember Veil rippled, as if the city had started speaking in a dialect it liked better. The Regent's mouth curved, not unkind. "Teaching over terror. Effective." Sarenvora leaned on her rail, foxfire making her hands look like the last honest embers in a dying hearth. "We should have married our cities sooner," she said to the Queen, rue warm as wine. "Work first," the Queen answered, but her eyes softened. "Then rings." The envoy raised his voice, forcing the protocol to push harder. The ink on the pillars hissed as if boiling in reverse. The scholar flipped through her ledger like a gambler counting saints. "We need a counter-protocol," she said, "something that uses observation against it." "Trial of names," the captain proposed. "Old soldier's game. Everyone present names the same thing at once. If a parasite claims the right to define, drown it in definition." Jace grinned, teeth in a storm. "Name what?" The Queen didn't hesitate. She lifted their wrists and spoke the single most dangerous sentence a ruler can say in public. "Name who owns Olyssar." Silence hit like a held breath before a dive. Then the city said its answer, not in one word but in thousands of throats landing on the same two. "We do." The bridges shook with it. The ink on the pillars flashed as if every thumb had just pressed again. The envoy faltered. "Protocol hates clarity, the way mold hates sunlight." The black-red mosaics steadied into a color that read as settled to whatever counts for a contract's nervous system. "Again," the Queen said, softer and more dangerous. "Who owns Olyssar?" "We do," the city answered louder. The Ember Veil bowed, a red sea acknowledging a name for a god it had always suspected was a crowd. The protocol recoiled, its syllables sizzled on the envoy's tongue. He tried to push through. His suit's runes crawled as if nervous. The Regent's gaze slid to him, with the weariness of someone who has paid too many clever men, too much for not enough. "Enough," she said, voice flat. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Some clauses use their readers like flutes. The child with the lantern walked forward to stand under the envoy's voice and lifted the steady flame between them. Light doesn't argue, it insists. The protocol warped, bent, and gutted against persistence that wasn't trying to win, just trying to last. Sarenvora spoke then, not as regent or creditor or foxfire myth, but as a woman who had once promised something on a bridge. "You can leave," she told the envoy, "or you can stay and watch us teach until dawn. Both are losses for you. Pick the one that hurts less." He lowered the parchment by inches, as if gravity had finally noticed it. His mouth worked around syllables that no longer wanted him. The wardens at his shoulders shifted, not to guard, but to stand where vendors stood, because someone had told them to earlier and the habit had set. Jace leaned his forehead to the Queen's temple again, the private ritual of people who have chosen the same side too many times to call it chance. "What's left?" he asked. "Dawn," she said, "and the part no one writes contracts for." A hush like the inside of a bell settled. Then boots clicked on stone. Not retreat, not advance, something stranger. From the far end of the bridge, a single figure approached, veilless, unarmored, carrying nothing but a small, sealed box. She walked like a clerk who had misplaced the end of the world and come to return it. She set the box on the plinth between the two oathwalks and looked up with eyes both cities recognized, because they were tired and kind in equal measure. For the Ember Pact's consort, she said, voice steady, from someone who signed nothing and owns everything that matters. She says you will know what to do. Jace's fingers tightened once on the Queen's wrist. He stepped forward, reached for the lid, and felt the heat through wood that meant more than fire. He lifted it. Inside the box lay something intimate and old, a coil of sigil lace folded like a promise kept, its edges darkened by use, its heart intact, copper deep with veinlets of ember that seemed to breathe when light found them. Jace lifted it with both hands. The warmth that rose wasn't flame, it was the echo of hands, of rites, of rooms, where vows had been spoken softly and enforced loudly. On the underside, stitched so faintly you had to want to see it, was a line drawing of two wrists crossed beneath the contour of a veil. "Do you know it?" he asked low. The Queen tilted her head, and for a heartbeat, Olyssar saw the woman beneath the mantle. "My mother wore one like this," she said. "Not to bind, to teach. When the veil chose poorly, she'd say, 'Tie the city to the part of the body that remembers.'" Sarenvora's smile unhooked tension from the air like a sheet being pulled straight. "And my grandmother would answer, 'If law forgets the pulse, remind the law of pulse.'" The envoy recovered enough audacity to rise on it. "Sentimental artifacts do not void adaptive protocol," he tried, raising the living parchment that already murmured, hungry for meaning to digest. The scholar turned a page and looked up with the clarity of a cold morning. "Not sentiment," she said, "an instrument. It's a rewrite tie. When two pulses bind under witness of the veil and the city answers, the lace records a new custom and pays it back to the first rite that tries to swallow it." The captain breathed like someone rediscovering ground. "So we can anchor Olyssar to dawn itself. Every time someone tries to rent the moon, the tie yanks the rope. If 10,000 eyes see it," the scholar added, "and if it's done where the first error nearly became precedent." The Oathwalk's plinth gleamed, remembering. Jace offered the lace. "Pulse?" The Queen gave him her wrist. When cloth touched skin, the sigil lace came alive, not scarlet for ownership, but amber for consent. Jace looped once, then again, and fixed the end with the humblest brooch he owned, a tailor's needle spearing living gold. "Vashtir!" Sarenvora called, already descending from the skiff to the twin walkway across the gap. She raised her wrist. "So the tie does not become a noose." The Queen nodded. Jace crossed their wrists, Olyssar and Vashtir, Veil and Foxfire, and cinched the knot. The city exhaled an "oh" that was neither word nor silence. Light moved, not along their arms, but through the streets. Bridges thrummed, pillars warmed, thumbprint mosaics flared awake. The protocol in the envoy's mouth sizzled like rain on hot stone. Letters on his sheets strained to change shape. They couldn't find a language that would take them in. "By witness of two cities," the scholar intoned, clear as a bell. "Tie bound, popular seal warmed. Record returned to its right of origin." The Regent watched, eyes of gold, thinking like a smith. "So that's how you buy a stage without money," she murmured. "You teach the audience to build." The envoy stepped back, then back again, but the boy with the cracked glass reed stood in front of him and held a note no one dared walk through. The nearest H6 turned his body into a wedge against crush. Obedience to the captain now matured into habit. "And now?" Jace asked, voice low, a corner of a laugh, his hand steadier than his heartbeat. "Now we name what we did," the Queen said. "Law loves names it can't forget." Sarenvora lifted her chin. "Call it the dawn tie," she suggested. "Because it pulls morning back when someone tries to sell it," Olyssar repeated, not by order, by appetite. "Dawn tie," and each syllable fastened another plank of tomorrow. The envoy played his last card. He raised the first mortgage, the one sealed with that fox's grin and human teeth. The seal popped and fell apart in clean soot, like coal that had finally finished its work. The moon, already sketching its corner of the sky, neither hurried nor slowed. It simply kept honest time. Window glass songs dropped into a key that meant rest. The Regent made a small gesture. Two Vashtiri officers stepped in, took the envoy's arm with courtesy that did not request consent, and guided him toward the stairs. "Mind the step," one said. He tripped on his own silence. "Is that the end?" the captain asked, blade still sheathed, as suits of victory designed to last. It's the scene, the scholar corrected. Endings are how we continue. The queen turned to the bridges, wrist tied to Saranvoras, and lifted their hands. Olyssar, she said, who writes your mourning? We do, the city answered, a thick whisper, low tide before the sun. A new wind crossed the arches, dustless, as if the night had washed its face. The next voice didn't come from above or aside. It came from the point where two pulses met, as if the tie had learned speech. Those who hold must learn to let go, it said, warm as an old ember. Now, loosen. Loosening wasn't undoing. It was remaking with room enough for daylight. Jace unwound a single coil, enough for their wrists to breathe without losing the knot. The sigil lace answered in low light, the humility of a job done right. Saranvora stepped back half a pace, diplomatic distance, not emotional, and inclined her head to Olyssar and to the sister of Story standing opposite. I return tomorrow, she told the Regent, with no accounts and no tricks. We'll bring bread and new laws. The Regent answered with a bow that would have split an impolite man in two. Bring music, she added, almost smiling. Olyssar is hungry for songs that buy nothing. The skiff rose, courtesy in its angle, foxfire dimmed to manners. Vashtir withdrew, not like defeat, but like someone closing the door from the inside to tidy the house. Olyssar exhaled. People resumed the habit of holding hands not to keep from falling, but to keep the flavor. The captain dismissed the perimeter. Wardens drifted into the market like lanterns, helping gather coins that now weighed like stories. The scholar shut her tome with a sigh that sounded like finishing a circle and opening another. We should write this down, she said, already hunting margins and live footnotes. We'll write it by living it, the queen answered, mantle settling on her shoulders with the good weight of a carried child. Jace was still looking at the lace. Who sent it? He asked the veilless courier, a small woman with the look of someone who knows times that clocks don't keep. The one who never signs, she said without ceremony. The one who cleans up after rituals end. Ah, Jace said, recognizing a species of royalty that wears no crowns. The city. Several, she corrected, and left without needing applause. Dawn began letting go of black, grey first, then a blue that only exists when day hasn't made up its mind. Olyssar looked taller, as if its columns had grown a finger's breadth under the new weight of a name. Dawn tie. Jace turned to the queen. Sleep or dance until we've explained to the sun what it missed. Work, she said with dangerous joy. We have to weld spectacle into statute before someone invents another rental, the captain pointed. First decree, public registry of contracts. No clause the city can't sound out loud. The scholar raised a finger. Second, mandatory hearth schooling for every youth who wants to handle paper that orders people. Jace lifted his hand like a bright student. Third, universal right to laugh in armor's face when it forgets what it's for. The queen looked at both of them, then at him. That goes in the preamble. They laughed, honest, relief with the taste of warm bread. The envoy was still there, misplaced furniture in the wrong room. The captain angled toward him, not to menace, but to deliver a choice. You can leave with your feet, she said, or you can be carried by our new curriculum. He glanced at the wardens, at their relaxed stances, at the vendors trading jokes with soldiers who'd stood where crush would have formed, and chose his feet. The crowd opened, not like fear, like water making a path for something that didn't float. Jace unwound the last half-turn of the lace and kept the knot. We should eat, he said, suddenly aware of hunger that had been postponed by law. Breakfast by statute, the queen said. Cinnamon fruit and plain bread. No feasts bought by signatures. They crossed back over Widow's span as the glass throats changed key to morning. Children raced ahead, chalk already out to draw new glyphs on old stone. Shopkeepers pulled up shutters, not like armor, like eyelids. At the plinth, the courier's box waited, now empty, now necessary. Jace set the lace inside, as if putting a heart back into a chest between beats. He closed the lid and left it for the Clerk of Dawn to file. Title? He asked, because even stories that refuse ledgers deserve a shelf. The queen looked over the city that had learned to say "we do," and then done it. Human, she said, savouring the word the Regent had used like a label and Olyssar had used like a compliment. "You can't just brush my wrist." Her smile sharpened. "You have to hold it." "Noted," Jace said, and when her hand found his again, the veil brightened the width of a grin. Above them, the moon completed its honest arc and left without invoices. Below, the bridges kept their names and added one more quietly, in chalk that would be ink by noon, the span between spectacle and statute. And somewhere in the market, a boy with a cracked reed held a perfect note just long enough for breakfast to begin.